Wherever our trains go, the economy comes to life. Norfolk Southern, one line, infinite possibilities.
Every day, Dominion Lineman Myron Burrell helps bring science to life, keeps our waterways healthy, and lifts our spirits by supporting the arts. Because communities run on far more than just electricity. Dominion, what we do every day powers your every day.
It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. Our guest today is Michael Nelson, the Fulmer Professor of Political Science at Rhodes College and the author of a new book about the presidential election of 1968, Resilient America, Electing Nixon in 1968, Channeling Dissent, and Dividing Government. Nelson's book contends that 1968 marks a pivotal moment in American politics, a year in which civil discord, political assassinations, racial violence, and the rise of new political constituencies appeared to be tearing America apart. He makes the case that instead, 1968 proved the resiliency of the American system of democracy. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
The conventional telling of 1968 is that it is this pinnacle moment of conflict and at a moment in time when it appears that American democracy is spinning apart because of racial violence, political assassinations, the deteriorating situation in Vietnam. So we remember 1968 as sort of revolutionary but also chaotic. You make a very different argument about the significance of 1968.
I do, and by the way, I don't quarrel with the fact that 1968 was an awful year in terms of stresses and strains on the American political system, and not the first terrible year, starting with the John F. Kennedy assassination in 1963, and then what seemed to be a kind of annual summer ritual of riots in the nation's inner cities, coming into 68 itself, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which seemed to undermine the idea that America had turned fighting around, the withdrawal from the election of President Lyndon Johnson, the entry of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, his assassination, preceded by Martin Luther King's assassination, the riots that attended the Democratic Convention that summer, all year long, the George Wallace third party candidacy, which was stirring a lot of emotions among especially blue-collar white voters, and a very close election at the end. A lot of people wondered, can the system withstand all these stresses and strains? And my argument is not that it wasn't a stressful year that pushed the American political system to the limit, but rather that in the aftermath of that election, the system managed to accommodate almost all these voices of dissent and encourage them to take their dissent back into the mainstream channels of American politics in ways that rejuvenated and as well as restoring the health of the political system.
It's interesting that the 1960s, we think of them generally as, while they have these terrible events that you've just mentioned, but that this is also the culmination of often the most hopeful aspects of American democracy. It's when we finally get around to the full liberation of African Americans and the women being freed from the regimented roles that American society had held for them for so long. Much broader democratization of the political process, more people involved. And so it's a period of idealism and hopefulness, but as other historians have said, also this transition from hope to fury by the end of the 1960s. But I don't think that we have talked much in the past about Richard Nixon specifically as having been the Republican agent or a precipitant player in quite the way you do of this change in the Republican Party that ultimately becomes the full abandonment of the GOP by African Americans, the embrace by the GOP of white conservatives in the South, the taking away from Democrats and liberals some of their core issues that animated what had been happening in the 1960s. But in your telling, I think Nixon comes off as much more the architect of the evangelical conservatism that is the dominant story of American politics over the next 40 years.
Well, you know, when Nixon ran for president the first time in 1960, he had been part of the ticket with Eisenhower in the previous two elections in which Republicans got 30–40% of the black vote. And in 1960, he was regarded by a lot of people who were involved in the civil rights movement as the candidate with a better record on civil rights than Kennedy. And Nixon tried to get African American votes, didn't succeed to the extent that Ike had. 64, Barry Goldwater, the nominee of the Republican Party that year, voted against the Civil Rights Act on principled grounds, I think. And Goldwater certainly didn't exploit racial tensions, but he ended up with 6% of the black vote in 64. So going into 68, I think Nixon realized winning anything more than a token number of African American voters is just not on the menu for any Republican nominee. On the other hand, there are a lot of white voters in the South. There are a lot of white voters in the blue-collar neighborhoods of the northern metropolitan areas who might be responsive to a Republican appeal, not in racial terms, but rather in terms of breakdown of law and order. And to people on the left, this was a code word for racism. But the fact was, in 68, violent crime rates were increasing dramatically. He was tapping into something genuine there. So I think Nixon's attitude towards civil rights issues was, I want to be pro-civil rights enough so that I don't turn off moderate white voters. But on the other hand, there are concerns out there among blue-collar white voters that deserve some attention.
And was that something that Nixon and the Republicans in that era were realizing even before Wallace comes along and has this surprisingly strong showing the first time that he runs for president? Or was it Wallace who awoke them to this possibility?
Well, you know, Wallace actually, in 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was riding absolutely high as any modern American president ever has for a period of sustained time, and got reelected overwhelmingly in 64. Wallace actually challenged Johnson in 3 Democratic primaries that year, all in the North. I think he fancied himself sort of like Robert E. Lee, you know, taking the battle to northern states and seeing how that might go. And he did pretty well in Indiana, in Wisconsin, in Maryland. He actually carried a majority of white votes in the Democratic primary. Well, this was sort of a signal to Republicans that there were a lot of Democrats out there who were not happy with the way the party was going in embracing civil rights, in launching a war on poverty, and doing all things that were seen by many white voters as taking money from them to give money to, in their view, undeserving minorities who didn't want to work.
How had it happened, though, that the Republican Party, in such a short period of time, after the party of Lincoln, the party that had gotten the credit for ending slavery at the end of the Civil War 100 years before, how was it that African-American connection to the party had disappeared so quickly, particularly given the Democrats had actually not done much for African-Americans themselves?
Well, there is an irony there, because when the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act were presented to Congress, a higher percentage of Republican members of Congress voted for it than Democrats. There were still a lot of conservative Southern Democrats at that time who filibustered against these Civil Rights Acts. But at the presidential level, it was John F. Kennedy who first introduced the Civil Rights Act that became the 64 bill. It was Democrat Lyndon Johnson who pushed the Voting Rights Act. And it had been for several decades the Democratic Party under FDR, under Truman, under Kennedy, under Johnson, who had been promoting economic programs that were not aimed specifically at African Americans, but which were disproportionately beneficial to African Americans. So Goldwater's nomination in 64 and his opposition to the Civil Rights Act against LBJ, the champion of civil rights, that was the crucial moment. But African Americans had been moving away from the Democratic Party ever since FDR. And what Goldwater first thought, and what Nixon then came to realize, and all Republican presidents have realized since then, or candidates since then, is that there are more votes to be gotten from conservative whites, especially in the South, than there are from trying to recover the original support Republicans had among minority voters.
And conversely, why was it that the Republican Party in the South, through this long period of time, hardly existed at all, but to the degree that it did exist, was overwhelmingly African American? I mean, how was it that status quo would come to pass?
Well, I think one of the things the Voting Rights Act of '65 did was suddenly there were a lot more African Americans who were able to register to vote and who did vote. And with them voting in great numbers, which had never been the case before in the Deep South, certainly, white voters in many cases came to see the Democrats as the party of black people and no longer felt at home there. Well, that created an opportunity. And in '68, of course, George Wallace was the one who pursued those votes most directly, and he carried almost all the Deep South states. But he was a passing phenomenon as an independent candidate. And what Nixon and the Republicans realized was these votes are up for grabs, and if it's us or the Democrats, we've got a better shot at it than they do.
Back in the day, in the 60s and the 70s, there was also a lot of discussion about essentially the tyranny of a one-party system, that across the South, effectively, there was only the Democratic Party. Whoever won the Democratic primary was always going to win any statewide vote. Democratic presidential candidates always carried the South. And there was some sense that conservatives, non-racial conservatives, began to advocate for the idea that there needs to be a second party to end this corrupt process by which we've ended up with a single party that controls the whole political structure. And so oddly enough, the birth of the new Republican parties in the South in the 1960s was viewed as a reform movement by many people, which is paradoxical in a sense in that today there's so much discussion about that the Republican Party inherited the old Dixiecrat white supremacist party. But I'm not sure exactly what my question is there.
I think what I'm hearing is it didn't start out that way. When the Republicans started to make efforts to become competitive in the South, we're really talking about the post-World War II years, when people like later George H.W. Bush moved to Texas. Lots of other Northerners were moving to Texas. Many of them had been stationed at Southern military bases during the war. They liked what they saw there. They saw opportunity there. So the Republican Party, the genesis, if you will, the first book of the Republican Party Bible in the South was based on economic conservatism, was largely driven by Northern migrants to the South. And that got them competitive, but it didn't get them winning. What they needed to do to become the majority party in the South, which is what they've become, is to join that sort of business economic appeal with this conservative appeal on the basis of racial issues, social issues like school prayer and abortion and so on. It's sort of built over the years. If you go back and you look at the political map of the 30s and 40s, the Democrats' strongest states in presidential elections were in the South, and their weakest states were in the Northeast. Starting with Nixon, that map gets entirely turned around so that the Republicans now are the dominant party in the South, and they've given up a lot of their strength in the Northeast. When Nixon became president, one of the smartest things he did politically was to abolish the draft, which meant that no college student ever had to worry about being forced to fight from that point on. It's an all-volunteer force. And we saw in subsequent wars, they were controversial. The Iraq wars, both of them were controversial going in, but we didn't see college students out there protesting in the way they did so effectively against Vietnam. Well, their personal incentive for getting out there was no longer around. They weren't going to be drafted.
In the lead up to 1968, you still have that the parties represent different things in different parts of the country. There are parts of the U.S. where Democrats are dominant, but where Republicans also still do reasonably well, moderate Republicans in that part of the country, and converse situations in other parts of America for both parties. During the 60s, you have the emergence of both, for the Republicans, both a figure like Strom Thurmond, who's actually an old-fashioned white supremacist Dixiecrat, but who becomes a harbinger of new republicanism. But at the same time, you also have young people like Haley Barbour, who eventually becomes governor of Mississippi, but he's an active worker in the 1968 campaign for Nixon, and whose belief in a new Republican Party isn't aspirationally driven as a Strom Thurmond, but sees it as reform.
As long as the South was a one-party Democratic region, even if the party nationally was moving in a liberal direction, you had the anchor of these conservative whites in the South, many of whom were the most influential members of Congress. For as long as the Republicans were strong in the Northeast, even in this basically conservative party, you had a strong liberal cohort. There was a lot of overlap ideologically between the two parties, and therefore more of a basis for compromise and cooperation across party lines. When the Republicans blast open the South and turn that into a magnet for white conservatives in that region, and then Northern voters see that happening and think, well, if the Republican Party is going to go that conservative, we don't have a home there anymore. We're going to move into the Democratic Party. Now you not just have Republicans versus Democrats, but it's essentially conservative Republicans versus liberal Democrats. And even in the South, because African Americans make such a large percentage of the Democratic primary electorate there, even in the South, if you're a white politician and you're a Democrat, you can't be a conservative very easily. You've got to accommodate the fact that most or close to most of the people voting in your primary are going to be African American voters who are going to be pulling you left.
And so at a time when Democrats in the South essentially have a requirement of all candidates to make segregationist pledges in the 1960s, it's essentially impossible to be a moderate Democrat that would also have...
That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, if not, never say impossible, but they are scarce, nearly endangered species, put it that way.
And then George Wallace, who we have to, just to remind ourselves, was the segregationist governor of Alabama, the famous standing in the schoolhouse door to prevent the integration of schools in Alabama, vows that segregation will live forever in Alabama. But so in a time when white supremacism was the doctrine of Southern Democrats through and through, why then does George Wallace have to depart from the Democratic Party to become an independent candidate for president?
Well, 68 is 3 years after the Voting Rights Act. And in the interim, hundreds of thousands of African Americans have registered as voters. Nationally, Wallace couldn't compete for the Democratic nomination with any chance of getting anywhere. And so he runs as an independent. That's interesting, and this is part of my evidence for the resilience of the political system. After the 68 election, the Democratic Party opens up its nominating process so that instead of party leaders in each state deciding who will be at the convention, now it'll have to be choices by Democratic voters. Wallace sees that door opening, and he decides in 1972 to run for the Democratic nomination. And he doesn't get it. Of course, he was shot along the way. He was severely wounded. But he was getting a lot of votes. He would have had a lot of delegates at that convention. And his people would have felt like a mainstream party now is open to us and will reflect our support for George Wallace at the convention.
And Wallace also, I take it, in the surprisingly strong performance that he has during the 60s seems to demonstrate that it's actually possible to wrest white voters in the South away from Democratic Party politics. And so I assume that's a sort of light bulb moment for Republicans.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a transition there. So we've all heard the phrase yellow dog Democrats, people who would vote for a yellow dog if that was who the Democrats nominated. Well, it's a little hard to go from being a Democrat, your father having been a Democrat, your grandfather having been a Democrat, straight to being a Republican. Voting for Wallace, running as an independent in 68, broke voters away from that lifelong loyalty to the Democratic Party, sort of freed them up, and then it was a little bit of an easier sell for Republicans to come in and scoop them up in 72. And the Democrats helped in 72 by nominating a very, very liberal candidate, George McGovern, who had no appeal to any white voters in the South in any numbers.
And in the meantime, the Democrats, over the course of the 60s, have gone from First, this extraordinarily popular president, John F. Kennedy, with appeal across a wide spectrum of political constituencies, then to Lyndon Johnson, who initially has this tremendous appeal, but then essentially collapses as a political figure. But then why does no other Democrat emerge in that vortex to carry the party forward into 1968?
Well, Johnson is driven from the race essentially because he withdraws on March the 31st. A few months earlier, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota had entered the race in what a lot of people thought was a quixotic candidacy, but McCarthy wanted somebody representing the anti-Vietnam position. McCarthy does astonishingly well in New Hampshire. Robert Kennedy gets into the race, now a senator from New York, the brother of the slain president. This is Johnson's nightmare. He withdraws. But he still had enough control over what was then a pretty closed nominating process that there was no way that McCarthy or Kennedy, even if they were winning primaries, were going to be able to get enough delegates to prevail. And then, of course, Kennedy's assassinated. So the anointed successor, so to speak, although Johnson was uncomfortable with this because he never gave up hope he might be the nominee of his party, was Hubert Humphrey, the vice president. Humphrey emerges as the nominee of the party that year.
And so Nixon now, we've had this dramatic reversal of fortunes. This guy who was almost president at the beginning of the decade, now the Democratic Party has somewhat fallen apart in terms of being able to present its best case in 1968. And so Nixon then is in a position to put together a coalition of forces that we haven't really seen before behind a Republican candidate.
That's exactly right. And on election day, Nixon got a little more than 43% of the national popular vote. Ordinarily, that's not enough to win you an election, but with a third-party candidate, George Wallace, who was carrying 5 states, and with Nixon managing to carry enough of the large states, he was elected without a mandate, to say the least.
And talk about how it was that he also took some of the steam, some of the wind out of the sails of the most powerful parts of the Democratic coalition at the time.
Well, Nixon, Nixon, essentially his appeal to the voters that year was two-pronged. One was very much the high road, and that is foreign policy statesmanship. I've been vice president, I've traveled the world, I've met with all these world leaders, I know how to protect the national security of the United States. That was the high road. The lower road, I don't want to say it was the lowest possible road he could have taken, but the lower road of his appeal was a kind of cultural populism. Historically, populism is a movement against the vested economic interests of Wall Street and the large corporations. But because of this churning we've talked about in the nation on race, we haven't talked about students on campuses rebelling, but all that is going on. Cultural populism meant attacking elites not on the basis of their wealth, but attacking elites on the basis of their control of the media, their control of the faculties of universities, their control of Hollywood, and the values that Nixon charged these new style elites represented that were really anathema to kind of the traditional values that most voters had. So Nixon never really appealed overtly on the basis of race, but he did appeal on the basis of cultural values and ran against the kind of new elite as he identified it.
And a return to stability after all of this discontent of the 60s.
Yes. Both Nixon and Humphrey were very familiar figures on the national scene, and I think the advantage Nixon had had prior to the November election was that he'd been a free agent for the last 8 years. And Humphrey had been a vice president for much of that period, very much under the thumb of Lyndon Johnson. So Nixon, I think, had more room to maneuver in representing himself. A big theme of the Nixon campaign was there's a new Nixon, seasoned by his defeat, tempered by reflection and so on in the years he's been out of power. Nixon was hoping that the media would write about him the way Churchill is described in the 30s, out of power but sort of recharging his batteries so he'll become the man you turn to. That, I'm not sure that idea ever took hold. Humphrey had been, the ultimate number 2 as vice president. Johnson had insisted on complete loyalty, and especially on issues like Vietnam, where Humphrey wanted to create some distance between himself and the Johnson policies, wanted to move more in a direction of I'll be the president of peace in Vietnam. Johnson, for most of that year, just said, if you do that, first of all, he said, there'll be blood on your hands. But second of all, the veiled threat was, I will pull the rug out from under you if you try to chart your own course here.
So how is it that Nixon ends up winning in 1968 when it's been only 4 years since a presidential election after which much of the prevailing wisdom was, can the Republican Party survive at all in the United States?
You know, if you look at the not just 1964 when the Republican nominee Barry Goldwater was defeated overwhelmingly by Lyndon Johnson, but if you take it back to the previous 9 elections, back to 1932, the Republican Party's track record in presidential elections was exactly the same as the Whig Party back in the 1830s and 1840s. In other words, they'd lost 7 out of 9 elections, and the only time they won was when they found a popular general whose appeal was beyond party. So a lot of people in '64, after those results came in, and by the way, a number of political scientists and very savvy political journalists said the Republican Party are headed toward the same extinction as the Whig Party. But a couple things happened. One is, in the aftermath of the '64 defeat, the Republicans chose a national chairman, Ray Bliss, who put ideology aside and just said, let's focus on the nuts and bolts of rebuilding this party at the grassroots. And Johnson, meanwhile, was not only ignoring the Democratic Party organization, but was emasculating it. So the Republican Party built itself in a way that made it more credible. And then because Johnson was pursuing such controversial policies, the Great Society, the Vietnam War, that created an opening for the Republican Party to sort of fill the void of people who were discontented with Johnson's presidency. Because they'd rebuilt themselves organizationally, they were able to do that. So the '66 midterms are a great triumph for the Republican Party. And the big winner among Republicans is Nixon, who had, again, with no responsibilities of holding an office, was able to spend that year campaigning for Republicans across the country and built up a lot of grateful candidates and leaders in the party and collected a lot of IOUs.
And so then we get to '68 and Nixon wins, and this begins then a reversal of all of the troubles that the Republicans had for so long. What is it, '68, and then the next 5 presidential elections, of those 6 contests, they win all but one, when Jimmy Carter's won victory in 1976. What is it then that what makes 1968 such a pivot that so quickly the party then becomes dominant in presidential politics?
Well, you know, you can almost look at Nixon's victory in '72 as a bit of arithmetic. In other words, the 43% he got in '68 plus the 14% Wallace got in '68 added up to the Nixon vote in '72. In other words, all those Wallace voters, and there were 10 million of them in 1968, all those Wallace voters who now were up for grabs, who'd voted independent in '68. It was Nixon who made the moves that won their support when he ran for re-election. And the Democrats, who by moving more to the left, sort of abandoned that constituency.
Is this part of the story that explains the current polarization of American politics, where there really are no moderates? I mean, how does this relate to the way things are working in 2014?
Well, again, it's part of all this sorting, and we've talked about a number of developments. You put all of those together, and what you see is that conservative whites are migrating into the Republican Party, in many cases from the Democratic Party in the South. In response, liberal Republican voters in the Northeast are migrating into the Democratic Party. There's a kind of sorting taking place. And at the end of the day, you end up with a party of liberals, which you'd never had in the country, the Democrats, and a party of conservatives, which again you'd never had in the country, the Republicans. The further apart they are from each other, the harder it is to find any middle ground once they're in office, to compromise, to reach accommodations. And we've been living with that ever since, with this change. Now it's the Democrats who usually control the presidency, and it's the Republicans who usually control Congress. So divided government, which is part of my theme in this book, where the president's party, in contrast to almost all of American history, where the president's party rarely controls both houses of Congress. That too reinforces the division between the parties, and as it plays out in government, the greater difficulty of arriving at solutions that people can live with, even if it's nobody's first choice.
It is the perception today that there's a greater disconnect between the two sides, and even less of an ability to work together or to come up with bipartisan or nonpartisan approaches to the problems of the country. The perception now is that that's worse than it's ever been. That's what's paralyzing decision making. Is that a fair assessment, or?
Well, we're not having a civil war, right? Again, the American political system after '68 showed great resiliency, which wasn't the case after the 1850s. So there's a sense in which, as conflict-ridden as our political system is, it's not to the point of coming apart at the seams. And even with the stark division between President and Congress, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal that we see today, even so, in times of great crisis, some of that gets put aside. We saw that after September 11th, 2001. We saw that in the financial crisis of 2008, where it's almost like the leaders of both parties and the members of both parties in office say, game time is over. This is serious. So even in the worst of worlds, which sometimes seem to prevail today, when the crisis is there, people get serious and find some way to work together.
The title of the book, Resilient America, makes clear that ultimately you see this survival of the process, evolution of the process as a positive thing on the whole, and a strength of American democracy. At the same time, though, it is a little difficult to look at a process that is closely connected to the current times we live in and see this evolution as a positive reflection on American democracy. But so where's the strength in the story?
Well, the strength in the story, I would put this way, that no living American has ever had to wake up on the morning of January 20th after an election and wonder, will this inauguration go forward, or will the people in power call out the troops? Will, in other words, the transfer of power actually take place the way it's supposed to at noon, or might the system come apart because those who have power won't let it go? That's the dog that never barked, right? That's the thing that nobody has ever had to even wonder about whether it would happen or not. And to me, that's the greatest testament to the resilience of the American political system, is that we get to take for granted what most of the people in the history of the world and on the face of the earth today have to treat as a matter of great uncertainty. That is, will power transfer peacefully according to the normal processes of election.
At the same time, though, in recent years, it seems that there's been more apocalyptic rhetoric in American politics than at least my recollection of things is, on both ends of the spectrum, actually. I mean, at the height of antipathy toward President Bush 43, you did have some liberals on the far left saying there'll be a military coup, he won't give up the White House. And now, even more harshly, we see Tea Party conservatives saying that President Obama is actually part of a gangster regime and that he might not give up the presidency. There are people who talk about secession today, a word that had disappeared from the American political landscape for 150 years. So
But this is just talk. It's talk by marginal people, right? Nobody has actually done anything based on the sincere belief that any of these apocalyptic scenarios are about to happen. And to me, that, if words, that's part of what you get to do under the First Amendment. You get to say whatever thing you want, crazy or otherwise. But those words haven't manifested themselves in any action. And again, to me, that's an extraordinary testimony to the depth of the vitality of our constitutional system of government. It can accommodate those extreme voices without succumbing to them.
In terms of the political pattern that we're in now, if we try to look for realignments in the past, you talked about the refreshing of the parties through some of this process. There are voices now who say similarly, don't worry about the extremism in both parties, because in reality it's extremism that brings in new blood and actually brings in new ideas. So should we be happy with the current process and anticipate that it's taking us to yet another configuration, or is this a distressing time?
If this is a distressing time, compared to what? I mean, we still have elections, we still have government, it still seems to function reasonably well, and if this is the worst, then I think that's pretty good testimony to the health of the overall system. If I have a fever of 102 degrees, that may be the worst day of my life, but if it ain't killing me, that's not bad.
After the 2008 presidential election in the U.S., and then even more so after 2012, there was a lot of talk that the Republican Party was on a path to oblivion then as well. Now the focus at that time was on the rise of Hispanics in critical areas and this complete abandonment of the Republicans by everyone but white conservative voters. But we've also seen in this period of time a real inability of a president who once had huge popularity to govern very effectively with one house of Congress in the hands of someone else. Why was it that that after '68 that the country was able to work reasonably well, even with, as you say, always a president of one party and a Congress controlled by another through so much that period of time?
Well, you know, from '68, and this had been true for 20 years and was true for maybe the next 20 years, you still had enough overlap ideologically between the two parties in Congress that you had conservatives in both parties, you had liberals in both parties. You didn't have ideology reinforcing the division between the parties. Instead, it was sort of bridging.
So let's do back up now and talk about some of these other figures, and how in '64 and '68 there's a whole cast of characters who are introduced on both sides that become names we hear about a lot for a very long time.
Well, it's an amazing cast of characters that enacts the election of 1968, and some of them were long familiar figures on the national stage for whom '68 would be their last appearance. People like Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, President Lyndon Johnson. This would be his swan song as he exits the stage. Then you had figures who'd been major players in American politics for years and were major players that year and after, like President Nixon, like Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic nominee. And then you had people who were making their debut on the national stage. Ronald Reagan made a serious bid for the Republican nomination in 1968 and had the latent support of a lot of Southern conservatives who, within the GOP, who with the slightest provocation would have voted for him instead of voting for Nixon. And it's one of my favorite things from the '68 Republican convention. I went and watched and listened to all the television coverage of that election at the Vanderbilt Television News Archive. And Walter Cronkite, after the balloting took place, said, yeah, Reagan had a pretty good convention. He may have a future, but he's probably too old. He was 57 at the time. So obviously his political future was going to extend for quite a while. So the cast of characters, I haven't mentioned Robert F. Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy.
George Romney.
George Romney. So you had George Wallace, of course, whom we've talked about. This was a time when politically sort of giants strode the earth, and that made the competition over ideas, over issues, I think all the more dramatic because no matter who you were in the American electorate, you felt like there's somebody out there who's representing me effectively, who's a candidate of substance and who's saying the things I like. You probably wouldn't like most people running, but you'd find somebody you did. And that, I think, talking about the resilience of the political system, having that cohort of leadership, I think probably helped smooth the transition from a very violent year, '68, to what came afterward.
When you look at George Romney, the father of the later presidential candidate Mitt Romney, but George Romney, who'd been the governor of Michigan and then was a member of Nixon's cabinet, not particularly well liked by President Nixon, as I recall, but Romney was the father Romney was someone who probably could not be at all functional or viable in the Republican Party of 2014. Is that right?
I think that's fair to say. Yeah. He was very liberal on civil rights, for example. He marched with Martin Luther King in Detroit in 1963, before Martin Luther King became the sort of iconic figure we know him as. I don't know that championing civil rights is a formula for career advancement in the Republican Party.
Particularly in that era, right?
Particularly in this era. But back then, it wasn't a liability for him. What really hurt Romney, who was the front runner for the Republican nomination for a while, what really hurt Romney that year was he was so ham-handed in his discussions of foreign policy. Well, he'd been a governor. He'd never dealt with Vietnam. And famously, he said that 2 years ago, meaning 1965, when I visited Vietnam, I got the greatest brainwashing you can imagine by the generals there. And when he said this in the fall of 1967, the reaction was sort of, well, how long does the brainwashing last? It's 2 years now, and you're just now getting over it. The point being, this is not somebody who really reassured the American people that he'd be able to handle foreign policy issues. So it wasn't his domestic policy issues that hurt him then, but they sure would hurt him now.
And then Richard Nixon was someone who's, while his Machiavellian aspects and his skills as a political operative and his ruthlessness, essentially, probably would serve him very well in the current political environment today, but his actual domestic policy would be very far out of touch from Republican politics. He was a believer in government, not particularly attached to the idea that government should get completely out of the way of business.
Part of what happened when Nixon became president is that he essentially ceded control of domestic policy to the liberal Democrats who by then were in control of Congress, which I think was another healthy development for the system, because liberal Democrats now felt like, well, our policies are getting enacted. But you look, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Equal Rights Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. These were programs that Nixon happily signed into law. And what he said privately to one of his chief aides was, domestic policy it's building outhouses in Peoria. He didn't care about that stuff. He was happy to let the Democrats in Congress do what they wanted to do there, and he would sign it into law. What he really cared about was foreign policy. And as long as the Democrats in Congress were willing to give him relatively free rein in that domain, it worked out pretty well for both parties.
And it also, in the same period of time, when we have George Wallace emerge as this third-party candidate who garners surprisingly large numbers of votes and really precipitates this resetting of the table of how the parties view things. But is there a scenario under which George Wallace could have remained a more substantial figure? I mean, ignoring the fact that he gets shot, the attempted assassination, but he picks a terrible vice presidential candidate in 1 year that brings him down. But is there some version of events? I know historians for sure and political scientists don't particularly like these sorts of purely speculative alternative histories, but why was it, or could it have been, that George Wallace could have emerged as a more central figure and even supplanted a Richard Nixon? Was there any scenario where that might have happened?
Well, in '68, Wallace's great and realistic hope for much of the year was to carry enough states, and he had this regional base in the Deep South, but he was popular throughout the South and throughout the border states like Kentucky and Maryland. He had a shot at winning 174 electoral votes. Now that was his ceiling. It wouldn't have been enough to win him the presidency, but what he was hoping was to win enough electoral votes so that neither Nixon nor Humphrey would gain a majority, and they would come, in his imagination, he could see them coming to him and saying, George, what would it take for you to throw your support to me? So Wallace had, even in '68, had a real shot at becoming, in the position at least, of a kingmaker. Now, honestly, I don't think Nixon or Humphrey would have made that kind of deal with Wallace, because it would have tainted their presidency overwhelmingly, but it was a scenario. After '68, Wallace goes back to Alabama. He's elected as governor. He realizes by 1970 there are now a lot of black people voting in Alabama. He stopped saying some of the nasty words he had been saying and actually started appealing to African-American voters. In '72, he runs a strong campaign for the Democratic nomination. Again, presidential nomination. He wasn't going to win it, but he certainly was going to have a big voice in the party. So until he is shot in May of '72. Wallace is maintaining his position as a national figure who had to be reckoned with by both parties.
And the vice president he had picked at one point along the way, the former general.
You know, here's the thing. We talk about third-party candidates, but there's really no third party. These are independent candidates. It's Wallace running. They're not the Wallace party. Well, Wallace didn't even want to have a vice presidential running mate, but most state laws require you have somebody on the ballot with you. And so he ended up picking former Air Force General Curtis LeMay. Now, interestingly, during World War II, Wallace had flown been part of the crew of B-29 planes under the general stewardship of LeMay. But he sort of built his career as an Alabama politician by saying, you know, my opponent can vote, people who are officers can vote for my opponent, people who are enlisted men can vote for me. Makes it strange that he would put General LeMay on the ticket. LeMay, at his debut performance, starts sort of thinking out loud about how nuclear weapons aren't all that bad. And here's Wallace, this is all live on television, here's Wallace saying, General LeMay doesn't mean this, you reporters are trying to put words in his mouth. Well, that didn't stop LeMay from talking about how, you know, you go back to some of these places where atomic bombs were tested and the rats are bigger than ever, you know, what's the problem? So Wallace was saddled with the fact that at some point, you've got to be more than just yourself. You've got to have at least a running mate. And I think a lot of voters who'd been tempted to vote for Wallace thought, you know, this is not a serious matter anymore. It's not a serious alternative anymore. And a number of them peeled away for Nixon or for Humphrey.
It's interesting how over this whole period of time from the 60s to the present that number one, we tend to always be surprised at the emergence of a third party or a third figure, but in reality, they come along with some significant regularity and often do have a big effect on the outcome of presidential elections. They also have this pattern of both introducing ideas into the discourse that eventually are adopted by one side or the other, but that become a central discussion point in American politics, but usually fail in part because without a party structure and without the wisdom of party operatives like the two big parties have, they make these kinds of mistakes. And we seem to be living in a period now where the Tea Party phenomenon, which clearly is related back to threads of this discussion, also blasted onto the stage, clearly affected the course of events, but can't seem to organize itself in a way that would to have sustained political power as opposed to some amount of influence. And the Republican Party realigning itself to accommodate what it can and what's useful of the Tea Party agenda, and now perhaps in a bid to wipe out the rest of it. But it is interesting that these third party alternatives or third figure alternatives do seem to be a repeating pattern.
Well, you know, I think something has changed that makes the appeal of going the third-party route less attractive. And that is both political parties have opened up their nominating processes. So now it's not just a few party leaders choosing the party's candidates. It's the voters in most states a primary. So the Tea Party phenomenon, for example. Back in the day, they would have had to form some sort of third party because the Republican Party leaders that controlled things back then would have shut the door on them. Now, if you're a Tea Party supporter, the door is open within the Republican primary process, and that's what we see again and again with the Tea Party, is using the primary process within the Republican Party to try to get their people onto the ballot and ideally into office. So, to the extent that in response to the '68 election, the two parties opened up their process, I think more groups in society that previously would have felt marginalized politically now can see a way that we can pursue our goals within one or the other party. And if you're a believer in the two-party system, which I am, that's a healthy development. Even if you don't like the results at any given moment, if there are groups out there that are severely discontented with the way things are, I'd rather they find a way to feel like they've got a shot by going through the existing political parties and feel like they have to go off and do something, you know, off the wall, off the charts.
Now, the contemporary Republican Party, over the past couple of years, as part of this sorting out with the Tea Party movement, in some places did in fact change its nominating rules to in effect open up the process, and then in a lot of places the Republicans were unhappy with the outcome. They ended up with candidates that were too conservative, who were deeply flawed. Now the party appears to be reestablishing the hegemony of a more central leadership.
Well, I think one of the great things about drawing people in who are sort of at the margin, drawing them in to the two parties, is you start getting involved in a party, and in this case we're talking about the example of the Tea Party and the Republican Party, and they get a taste of, you know, if we've got to think in terms of how can we get a candidate on the ballot who we agree with mostly but also can get elected. And this year, in contrast to the last couple elections in which the Tea Party has been active, I think you're seeing Tea Party people who are more inclined to think, yeah, we don't want to nominate a true believer who's going to lose. We see that happen. Now, because they're working through the process, they see, you know, if we can have somebody who speaks to most of our concerns, but who isn't going to turn off so many voters that they lose, and we end up with somebody in office. That's a healthy, open party system that will draw new ideas and people who are dissatisfied with the current workings, draw them into the process and get them focused on what do we need to do to attract a majority of votes. Well, that's a pretty healthy thing, in my view.
So 68 was a year in which the Republican Party, even though we think of 68 as a kind of a year of liberal power and liberal climax, 68, I think you make a pretty persuasive case, is also marks this rejuvenation of Republican politics and conservative politics right after obituaries were being penciled out for the Republican Party. Now we're in a current moment where just the other day, it seems like the obituaries for the GOP were being written again, but it doesn't look like a dying party in 2014. So are we about to see a similar kind of parallel sort of rejuvenation of the GOP, or where are we in that process?
Well, this year might be a sort of false dawn for the Republican Party because, we talked about earlier, the electoral map is sort of stacked in their favor. And it being a midterm election, the rising Democratic constituency, minorities, young people who were so instrumental in 2012 and 2008 with Obama, they're much less likely historically to vote in midterm elections. So the Republicans may have a good year that sort of enables them to postpone what might be a day of reckoning in the future, where they've got to accommodate the fact that a larger percentage of voters are not white, and they're going to have to broaden their appeal in a way that, say, George W. Bush was very successful in doing when he was president. They're going to have to broaden their appeal. In 2016, maybe the spanking that, you know, causes that realization.
And also, the one other element of this that I think is really important in the present, you talk about what happened in terms of Republicans gaining control and significance in the South, and having held that now pretty continuously until very recently. But in the past two elections, there have been these very significant inroads into not a large number of states, not a lot of electoral votes, but big victories in Virginia and North Carolina, and that mattered a lot, in Florida, obviously, if we look at both elections. But we've also seen that a lot of states in the South that were solidly Republican are now very close. Georgia was within 4 or 5 points in both of the past two elections. Big demographic changes in the South, people moving to the coastal South. And now you have, for instance, in Georgia, the grandson of Jimmy Carter running for governor against a well-established Republican in a race that could be real. So how viable is it that this foundation of the GOP in the Deep South and the Mid-Atlantic could really begin to rupture in significant ways in the next 1, 2, 3 election cycles?
Well, if the Republicans start losing ground in the South, that's going to be a shot across the bow. That's going to make them realize that we've either got to figure out what's causing us to lose ground in our strongest region, or if our strongest region is now going to become more competitive, we're going to have to find ways to appeal to voters in traditionally Democratic states. I think it's good when parties suffer setbacks, because that's, as a political party, maybe even as a human being, there are things that force you to do some self-examination that you wouldn't do if you weren't forced to. And a big defeat for a party is often what it takes, as with the Republicans after '64. It's often what it takes to make a party think, what are we doing wrong, and what do we need to do to get back in in the game. That's a rejuvenating process. We've had these two political parties now for 150 years. The Democrats have been around even longer. You don't get to last that long in the political world unless you learn from your failures and rejuvenate yourself so you can get back into competition. And I think that's what we can expect in the future. And that is, there's no reason to think parties who want to win elections are not going to do some self-scrutiny when they start losing those elections.
Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you.
Wherever our trains go, the economy comes to life. Norfolk Southern, one line, infinite possibilities.
Every day, Dominion Lineman Myron Burrell helps bring science to life, keeps our waterways healthy, and lifts our spirits by supporting the arts. Because communities run on far more than just electricity. Dominion, what we do every day powers your every day.